Welcome back, everybody. So now that we know about sexual reproduction and we know how gametes are made by meiosis, we want to link that to the inheritance of traits, what's known as genetics. And we will start with the simplest kind of genetics, which is called Mendelian genetics. So what is Mendelian genetics? Well, any trait that is controlled by a single gene is called a Mendelian trait. They're so named after an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel, who lived in the 1800s, who conducted thousands upon thousands of experiments on pea plants. And these pea plants just so happened to have a lot of single gene traits. And Mendel's experiments showed something about genetics 50 to 100 years before anybody really understood what a gene was. So Mendelian genetics is the study of the inheritance of these single gene traits. Some examples of human traits that are Mendelian or nearly so include brown versus blue eyes, attached versus free-hanging earlobes, the ability to taste certain chemicals, widow's peak or non-widow's peak hairline, etc., etc. In addition, there are several important diseases that are Mendelian, most notably sickle cell anemia and hemophilia. And color blindness also behaves as a Mendelian trait. In order to understand Mendelian genetics, there is a lot of vocabulary that we have to learn, and I want to introduce that today so you will have that down quickly. You already know that a gene is a length of DNA that codes for an RNA or a polypeptide. It has a physical location on a chromosome. We call that physical location the locus of the gene. And we know that every chromosome contains hundreds or perhaps 1,000 or two genes. If we think of a gene as a physical location, as a locus, then at any given locus, the actual sequence of nucleotide bases may be different between two separate homologous chromosomes or between two individuals. If the different sequence of nucleotides gives rise to a different protein that causes a different physical trait, then we call these forms alleles. For example, the gene for flower color in Mendel's pea plants may have a white flowered allele or a purple flowered allele. And here's an example of what we're talking about. So here is a pair of homologous chromosomes. Here is the locus for the flower color gene in peas, and on one chromosome in this individual is the allele for white flowers, and on the other is the allele for purple flowers. You know, because of your study of transcription and translation, that genes do not directly create the trait that is attributed to them. What do they do instead? They code for a protein which may or may not be expressed, that is transcribed and translated and then activated. And it is the protein that causes the effect attributed to the gene. Now that's an important thing to remember as you become more sophisticated in your genetic understanding. You also know that genes can be expressed, which means they're turned on and transcribed and translated, or not expressed. They can be turned off. And they act as if a switch turns them on and off. And the switches are often themselves other genes, which will switch a protein-producing gene on. You already know that everybody has two alleles for each gene. Now, some alleles bring about an effect whenever they are present, regardless of what the other allele is. For example, if a pea plant has a purple allele and a white allele, it has purple flowers. It doesn't matter that it has that white allele, it still gets purple flowers. Thus we say the purple allele is dominant and the white allele is recessive because the purple allele is expressed. In this genetic system, therefore, if a plant has white flowers, what alleles must it possess? You've thought about it? Okay. Hopefully you answered that both alleles must be recessive to have the recessive trait of being white, because if there's one purple allele, it'll turn the flowers purple. Now there's a bunch of conventions associated with the alleles, and here are the conventions we will use in this class. Dominant alleles are typically given a one-letter code and are capitalized. Recessive alleles are given a lowercase code of the same letter. So for example, in the purple allele case, we may have a capital P for the purple allele and a small or lowercase p for the white allele. Here is a pro tip. It's a good idea to use a letter that has a different looking upper and lower case when you write it out. So P is often not a good example because in handwriting it's difficult to see the difference between an uppercase and a lowercase p unless you use script. On the other hand, R, B, and A are all good letters for representing alleles. You know that every organism gets 2 copies of each gene, one from its mother, one from its father. Imagine a gene for which there are 2 alleles, and we're going to use the purple flower allele and the white flower allele again. Then each individual in the population has one of 3 possible combinations of alleles. They could have the big P allele, the big P allele, or the little p allele. So they have one of 3 possible combinations. We call the actual alleles possessed by an individual its genotype, and that's a vocabulary word you need to know. We have words, of course, for every possible genotype. If the genotype has both alleles the same, we call it homozygous, meaning they have the same alleles. Can you guess what we call it if they have both alleles different? You've got it. It's heterozygous. If both alleles are the dominant allele, let's say big P, we call the genotype homozygous dominant. What do you think we call the genotype when both alleles are recessive, little p? Yup, you're right. We call it homozygous recessive. Another pro tip, heterozygotes are not referred to with the words dominant or recessive, although they typically display the dominant trait. We simply say that they are heterozygotes, and that implies that they have a dominant allele and a recessive allele, if there are only 2 alleles in the population. So that's it for today. It is very important that you make vocabulary cards or a vocabulary list and you get these words down because we'll be using them immediately. Until next time, go outside, look at nature, ask biological questions, bring them back to class. And I can't wait to see you soon.